The smell of damp concrete and cheap diesel usually grounds me. It's the smell of progress, of something tangible rising from the mud of a Cleveland autumn. But this morning, as I stood in the skeleton of the Lakeview residential complex, the air felt thin, like it couldn't hold the weight of my lungs. I stared at the screen of my phone. I hit refresh until the screen blurred. 0. Not just low, fucking 0. The payroll, the taxes, the money for the guy's kids, all gone in one click. My life's work vanished while I was checking the grade on a slab. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud that sounded like a shovel hitting dry earth. "Boss, the concrete truck is backing in. Where do you want the first pour?" I didn't look up at Miller. I couldn't. If I met his eyes, I'd have to tell him I couldn't pay for the load. I'd have to tell him the men's checks would bounce by Friday. I felt a drop of cold sweat slide down my spine, chilling me despite the heavy canvas of my work jacket. The crunch of gravel under tires interrupted the idling roar of the mixer. It wasn't a truck. It was a silver sedan, sleek and out of place among the rusted pickups and heavy machinery. The passenger door opened, and Elena stepped out. She looked immaculate. Her hair was pulled back into a tight professional bun, not a strand out of place in the biting wind. Behind her followed a man in a charcoal suit, clutching a leather briefcase like a shield. "Thomas," she said. Her voice was devoid of its usual warmth, replaced by a clinical sharpness that made my skin crawl. I stepped off the plywood ramp, my boots sinking slightly into the grit. "Elena? What's going on? The accounts. I just checked the bank. Someone moved everything. We need to call the fraud department." She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply waited for the man in the suit to hand her a thick manila envelope. "There is no fraud, Thomas. Only a long overdue settlement," she said, her tone as cold as the Lake Erie breeze. She stepped forward and pressed the envelope against my chest. I didn't take it, so she let it drop. It hit the mud with a heavy thud. "Those are your copies. I filed for divorce. I've also filed an injunction to halt any further withdrawals from the business entities." I looked around. My crew had gone silent. The hum of the job site died down as the men realized this wasn't a site visit. They were watching their boss get gutted in broad daylight. "A settlement?" My voice came out as a raspy shadow of itself. "You emptied the payroll, Elena. That's not a settlement. That's theft. We have contracts. We have people depending on us." "Us?" She tilted her head, a faint, mocking smile touching her lips. "It's business, Tom. You're great with a hammer, but you can't even spell capital gains. I didn't steal it. I've been paying myself a salary for 20 years of babysitting your ambition. The locks are already changed." "I built this company with my bare hands," I hissed, stepping closer. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral, clashed violently with the smell of wet sawdust. It felt like a physical assault. "You swung the hammer, Thomas. I told you where to hit," she countered. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper intended only for me. "The money I moved? Consider it my backdated consulting fee. I've spent years being the builder's wife, dragging your lack of ambition uphill. I'm done. I've taken what the law and my own foresight dictates is mine." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized I was staring at a stranger. The woman I'd shared a bed with for 20 years had been replaced by a predator who had been measuring me for a coffin while I slept. "You're leaving me with nothing," I said, the realization finally sinking in. The machinery, the debt, the lawsuits that would follow this freeze, it was a mountain of rubble, and I was at the bottom of it. "I'm leaving you exactly what you started with," she said, turning toward the car. "A pile of rocks and a loud voice." "Try not to hurt yourself with the heavy lifting." The suit opened the door for her. As the sedan pulled away, kicking up a cloud of gray dust that coated my tongue with the taste of ash, I stood alone in the center of the site. The silence of the crew was louder than any engine. I looked down at the envelope in the mud, my reflection staring back at me from a dark puddle. My face looked older, etched with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. She thought she had taken everything. She thought she had left me buried. But as I felt the cold wind bite into my face, a new sensation began to stir beneath the shock. It wasn't the heat of anger, it was the icy, calculated clarity of a man who knows exactly how to tear a structure down to its foundations. She forgot one thing. I'm a builder. I know where the load-bearing walls are, and I know exactly which one to pull to make the whole world come crashing down on her head. The springs of the motel mattress groaned, a rusted, rhythmic protest that echoed the dull thud in my lower back. I lay there in the dark, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the coastline of Lake Erie. My breath came out in a thin, gray plume. The heater had died at midnight, and the damp chill of a Cleveland December was already clawing through the thin walls of room 112. My back screamed every time I turned over on the stained mattress. I didn't mind the pain. I minded that she was probably lying on 800 thread-count sheets I'd paid for with my broken spine. I'd worked 80-hour weeks for a decade to build her a fortress, only to find out she'd been undermining the foundations the entire time. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a cracked plastic surface that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap disinfectant. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't. But the thumb has a memory of its own. The screen flared to life, stinging my eyes. Social media was a window into a life that had been stripped from me like old siding. There she was, Elena. She was standing in a gallery I'd helped renovate, wearing a coat that probably cost more than my Ford F-150 was worth on a trade-in. Beside her stood Mark, a man with teeth too white and a suit too sharp for a city like this. An investment partner, the caption said. They were launching a new, boutique residential concept in the flats. My money. My equipment. My 20 years of sweat equity rebranded as a visionary partnership. She wasn't just taking my bank account. She was wearing my life like a stolen fur coat. I rolled onto my side, the pain in my back forcing a ragged gasp from my throat. The divorce papers were stacked on the floor next to a half-empty bottle of generic aspirin. The injunctions had been surgical. She'd frozen the business accounts, claiming quote, _for___, while her lawyers picked the carcass clean. The house was gone. The yard where I'd planted Japanese maples was now a crime scene of legal tape. I was 45 years old, and my entire world fit into the bed of a rusted truck parked outside a $6 an hour motel. The silence of the room was heavy, thick with the smell of my own unwashed work clothes and the metallic tang of the radiator. I felt a hollow cavern opening in my chest, a void where my pride used to live. I was a general contractor who couldn't even fix his own life. I was debris, just another pile of rubble waiting to be hauled to the landfill. I stood up, my knees popping like dry kindling. I walked to the small cracked mirror above the sink. The man looking back was a stranger. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard shot through with gray, his face etched with the deep, permanent lines of a man who had spent too much time squinting into the sun and the wind. I looked at my hands, They were scarred, the knuckles swollen, the skin permanently stained with the grit of 1,000 job sites. Elena thought she'd won because she took the mind and the money. She thought the muscle was useless without her direction. "You left me with a pile of rocks, Elena," I whispered to the empty room. My voice was a low, jagged rasp. I thought about the Lakeview project. I knew the specs of that building better than I knew my own heartbeat. I knew where the corners had been cut to save her consulting fees. I knew which load-bearing pillars were resting on shaky soil. I didn't need a corporate account to start over. I didn't need a suit or a clean haircut. I grabbed my heavy canvas jacket from the chair. It was stained with oil and dust, heavy and honest. I felt the weight of my tape measure on my belt. She wanted to see what I could do with a pile of rocks? Fine. I'd start at the bottom. I'd take the back-breaking jobs, the demolition work, the filth that men like Mark wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. I would bury myself in the work until I was part of the geography of this city again. I headed for the door, the cold air from the parking lot already whistling through the gap in the frame. She forgot how a structure actually stays up. It's not the gold leaf on the crown molding or the quote, _9 in the brochure. It's the grit in the mortar. It's the things buried deep in the dark where nobody looks. I climbed into the Ford, the engine turning over with a reluctant, guttural roar. As I pulled out of the motel lot, leaving the flicker of the neon sign behind, the hollow feeling in my chest began to harden. I wasn't going to build her another house. I was going to learn exactly how to take hers apart, brick by agonizing brick. The rasp of a wire brush against rotted oak is the only thing that keeps the ringing out of my ears. It's a rhythmic, punishing sound, metal teeth tearing away decades of neglect, exposing the pale, honest grain hidden beneath the filth. I don't take the easy jobs anymore. I don't touch the luxury flips or the modern concepts that Elena and her new shadow Mark are plastering all over the billboards in the flats. I didn't need an office. I needed my tools. I started taking the jobs she was too elegant to touch. Foundations that were literally sinking. While she was selling visions in the flats, I was digging through the dirt, buying up every distressed lien her new boyfriend's company touched. I specialize in the carcasses of buildings that other contractors want to bulldoze. The Victorian estates with caved-in joists. The pre-war libraries where the smell of mold is so thick you can taste it on the back of your throat. They call me when the structural integrity is a joke and the blueprints are a lie. __quote _12 __. A voice says, cutting through the haze of sawdust. I stop brushing and look up. Claire is standing by the scaffolding, her boots coated in the same gray lime dust as mine. She's an architect, but not the kind who stays in a climate-controlled office sketching glass boxes. She carries a flashlight and a level like they're holy relics. She's the first person in months who hasn't looked at me with pity or calculated greed. "It's the flashing," I say, my voice sounding like gravel being turned in a mixer. The previous crew used cheap aluminum and covered it with caulk. A quick fix for a quick buck. It held just long enough for the check to clear, and then the rot started eating the heart out of the house. I climbed down the ladder, my knees giving their usual mechanical pop. The pain is still there, a constant hum in my lower back, but it's different now. It feels like a toll paid for honest passage, not a weight dragging me into a grave. My hands are thick with new calluses, the skin scarred and stained with linseed oil. But they don't shake when I hold a chisel. Claire hands me a thermos of black coffee. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 15 underscore, underscore. I take a sip, the heat searing my tongue. Quote 16, quote, I mutter. Quote 17, quote. Quote 18, quote, she says softly, her eyes tracking the precision of the joints I've spent 14 hours perfecting. Quote 19, quote. I don't answer. I turn back to the oak beam. Since I opened the shop, I've rebuilt more than just structures. I've rebuilt my defense. Every contract I sign now is a fortress. Every payment goes into an escrow account she can't touch, protected by a legal team I hand-picked for their teeth. I don't trust a handshake anymore. I trust ironclad clauses and third-party audits. My business is a closed loop, a machine with no entry points for vultures. Word has spread through Cleveland like a slow-burning fire. In a city of shortcuts and kickbacks, a man who tells the truth about a cracked foundation is a rare commodity. The underscore underscore quote underscore 20 underscore underscore, the old families and the preservation societies started calling. They don't want the visionary concepts Elena is selling. They want buildings that will stand for another 100 years. By the time the first snow of the year hits the warehouse roof, Restoration Soul isn't just a shop. It's the most respected name in the state. My body has hardened, the soft edges of a comfortable life stripped away to reveal something lean and utilitarian. My mind is no longer a fog of betrayal. It's a blueprint. Late at night, when the saws are silent and the only smell is the sharp, clean scent of fresh cedar, I sit at my desk and look at the news. Elena's Lakeview project is hitting underscore underscore quote underscore 22 underscore underscore. There are whispers of structural settling, of materials that aren't meeting code. I see her face in the digital photos, the tightness around her eyes, the way she clings to Mark's arm like a person realizing the ground beneath them is made of sand. She thought she took the mind of the operation. She thought I was just the muscle that swung the hammer. She forgot that you can't build a skyscraper on a swamp. You can dress it up with marble and gold leaf. You can hire the best PR firms in the country. But if the foundation is rotten, the gravity always wins. I pick up my level and check the edge of the table I'm building for a local judge. It's perfect. Dead center. I'm not the man in the mud anymore. I'm the man who knows exactly how much pressure a structure can take before it screams. And I'm just getting started. The scent of expensive lilies always used to mean a celebration, or perhaps a peace offering after a cold week in our marriage. Tonight, as I stood in the grand foyer of the restored State Theater, the smell of those flowers felt like an allergen, something my body had finally learned to reject. I adjusted the cuff of my charcoal suit, not the off-the-rack polyester I used to wear to weddings, but a heavy tailored wool that felt like armor. My hands, still mapped with the faint white scars of my trade, felt steady as I held a glass of mineral water. I didn't need the liquid courage anymore. The crystal chandeliers above us, which I'd personally overseen the rewiring of, cast a sharp, unforgiving light on the crowd of Cleveland's elite. "A masterpiece, Thomas," the mayor had said earlier, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't just fix the walls. You gave this city its pulse back." I didn't tell him that I'd simply stripped away the rot and replaced the lies with solid steel. That was my business now. I felt her before I saw her. It was a shift in the air, a sudden drop in the room's temperature that had nothing to do with the HVAC system I'd calibrated to perfection. I turned slowly. Elena was standing by the shadow of a Corinthian column, clutching a clutch bag like a life preserver. The 3 years since she'd walked off my job site had not been kind. The sharp, clinical edge she'd worn like a weapon had dulled into something frantic. Her designer dress hung loose on her frame, and the skin around her eyes was tight, not from age, but from the kind of sleeplessness that comes when the federal auditors start knocking on your door. I'd read the headlines. The Lakeview project hadn't just settled. It had practically groaned under the weight of her vision. Substandard rebar, diverted funds, and a paper trail that led directly to her and Mark's offshore accounts. Mark was already facing indictment. Elena was looking for a way out of the rubble. "Thomas," she whispered. Her voice lacked the jagged authority I remembered. It was thin, vibrating with a desperate frequency. "Elena." I didn't move toward her. I stayed in the light. She took a step forward, her eyes darting toward the photographers near the stage. "You look... well, the theater is beautiful. I always knew you had this in you, even when I was pushing you to be more." The lie was so effortless it almost commanded respect. I looked down at her, seeing the fine cracks in her foundation. The expensive perfume couldn't mask the smell of cold sweat and defeat. "I'm in trouble, Thomas," she said, her voice dropping to a low, hurried hiss. "The investigators, they're twisting everything. They're making my management look like criminal intent. They're calling for a deposition from my former business partners. They're asking about the early days of our firm." She reached out, her fingers hovering near my sleeve, but she didn't dare touch the fabric. "I need you to speak for me," she pleaded. "Tell them how we worked. Tell them I was the one handling the complexities you didn't want to touch. If you testify that the financial structures were established during our marriage, that it was standard practice for us, I can get a plea. I can save what's left." I watched a bead of sweat ruin the perfection of her foundation. "Standard practice? I spent 20 years thinking we were building a future, Elena. You spent 20 years building a trapdoor. We were a team," she snapped, a flicker of the old venom returning to her eyes before fading back into fear. "You owe me that much. For the 20 years. For the life I helped you build. You wouldn't be standing here in this suit if I hadn't pushed you out of the mud. It's your duty, Thomas. As a man who values integrity." I looked past her. Near the refreshment table, Claire was laughing at something the lead engineer said. She looked up, caught my eye, and gave me a small, grounding nod. She knew who was standing in the shadows with me, but she didn't look worried. She knew the strength of the materials I was made of now. I turned back to Elena. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I didn't feel the cold sting of the betrayal that had nearly buried me in that motel room 3 winters ago. I felt the same thing I felt when I looked at a beam riddled with dry rot. A quiet, objective recognition that some things are beyond saving. I've made it a rule only to provide professional character references for people I actually know, Elena, I said. My voice was calm, resonating with the quiet authority of the architecture surrounding us. "What is that supposed to mean?" she trembled. "I'm your wife. I was your wife for half your life." I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool weight of the glass. The woman I was married to wouldn't have gutted a payroll account and left 100 men without a paycheck. The woman I knew wouldn't have used a partner's sweat to buy a stranger's loyalty. I stepped closer, leaning into her space just enough to see the pupils of her eyes dilate in terror. "I'm not here to save you, Elena. I'm the guy who bought your debt 2 weeks ago. See, you managed the books, But you forgot that if the interest isn't paid, the whole house gets repossessed. Enjoy the deposition. I have a gala to attend." "Thomas, please," she whimpered. "They'll take everything. I'll have nothing left." "Then you'll be exactly where you left me," I said. I glanced at my watch. It was time for the final toast. Except I had a toolbox and a level. All you have is a briefcase full of broken promises. I stepped around her, moving toward the warmth of the crowd, toward Claire, and toward the life I'd built with my own scarred hands. "Wait!" she called out, her voice cracking in the vast, echoing space of the foyer. "You can't just leave me here!" I didn't look back. The acoustics in the State Theater are perfect. I designed them that way. I could hear her sobbing in the dark corner by the pillar, a small, hollow sound that was quickly drowned out by the thunderous applause of people who actually knew how to build something that lasts.